Good evening, everybody. I think you can all hear me, and welcome to this event. My name's Matt Ridley, and it's my huge honor to be able to speak to and introduce to you Richard Dawkins on the day that he publishes a new book. The book is called Books Do Furnish a Life, and it's a collection of his writings, his essays, his reviews, his forewords, his squibs, his conversations, his shorter works in one place. It's published today, and it is a rich feast of his extraordinary writing. Richard is a fine scientist, a rigorous thinker, and a fearless polemicist, but he is also a supremely gifted writer, and that's what this book is about. It's Richard Dawkins, the writer, on so many fascinating subjects. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Richard to introduce the book for 5 minutes to us. Then I'm going to ask him some questions, and then I'm going to ask him your questions. So if you can put your questions in the Q&A, they will then reach me by a magical process, and at about 7:10 I will start asking some of them to him, and we'll finish at about 7:30. So with that, Richard, welcome. Thank you for joining this event, and tell us why you've written and put together this book.
Well, thank you, Matt, very much. In the early 2000s, I collected a set of my essays called A Devil's Chaplain, and then more recently than that, about 5 years ago, I suppose, I did another collection with Gillian Summerscales called Science in the Soul. And Gillian and I worked very closely on that, and we decided that there were just too many for one volume of these past essays. So we decided to split it into 2 volumes, and the obvious way to split it was to hive off those essays which were about books. So quite a lot of them turned out to be forewords to books, afterwords to books, reviews of books, commentary on books. And it was clear that they would about fill another volume of the same length as Science in the Soul. So one way to see this is as a kind of volume 2 of Science in the Soul, again edited by Gillian Summerscales, but this time it's all about books. Gillian divided it up into 5 sections. I can't take credit for the division of the book into 5 sections, nor for the, I think, rather witty titles of the chapters, which she invented, nothing to do with me. They're not the same as my original titles. Each of the 5 sections is introduced by a conversation with another scientific author, beginning with Neil DeGrasse Tyson for section 1, then Adam Hart Davis, who's a well-known, I suppose, television radio personality with a scientific bent, then Steven Pinker, whose name will be known to everybody very well, but linguist, psychologist, and optimist like you, Matt. Then the 4th one is Christopher Hitchens. This is a particular case. I was the last person, I believe, to interview Christopher Hitchens when he was under sentence of death from cancer and was in Texas undergoing special treatment. I was invited that December to guest edit New Statesman, the Christmas issue of New Statesman. And one of the things I did was to interview Christopher Hitchens in his Texas residence, a borrowed residence. And the following day, I presented him with the Richard Dawkins Award, which was organized by one of the atheist organizations. We had a very long conversation, which I recorded on an iPhone and various other devices. And then New Statesman printed much of it. And that's the bit that is in this book. It is in Books Do Furnish a Life. However, the audio version of the book, for the audio version, we decided to go back to the original recording. And so unlike the other 5, the other 4 rather, it's not a professional recording, it's just my recording with an iPhone. but it does have a certain historical significance because it's the last interview he ever gave. And it's much longer than the transcript which appears in the printed book. So it's a kind of bonus that you get from the audio book is the complete interview with Christopher. The next one.
I'm going to interrupt you there because
sure, yeah.
Because I did something similar with Francis Crick. I interviewed him for several hours a few weeks before the 50th anniversary of the double helix discovery on tiny digital devices that I'd bought in an airport, 2 of them.
Yes.
And it was very hard to get the stuff downloaded, but it turned out to be the last long interview he did before he died. So it's quite
important. How interesting. Yes.
Anyway, go on.
And then the next section, the interview is with Lawrence Krauss. That's another fairly interesting one. He's a well-known physicist. And I first met him when I was I gave a talk, I think it was in either Seattle or San Diego, I can't remember which, somewhere out on the West Coast. And afterwards, a man stood up in the audience and started haranguing me with sort of highly articulate criticism. And I thought, this is no ordinary audience question. This man knows what he's talking about and knows how to say it. And it turned out to be Lawrence Krauss, who I hadn't met before. And afterwards, he sought me out and we had a drink together. And he kind of softened his tone then when we were face to face over a drink. What he was attacking me for was being too aggressive towards religion. I mean, he's an atheist too, but he thought that the right way to win friends and influence people is seduction rather than coming out with all fists flying, which he accused me of. And we had a long talk about that, and then we decided to reprise that conversation in the pages of Scientific American, one of those exchanges in print where you say, "Dear Lawrence, dear Richard," and so on. And so that's reprinted here. But then, because it was supposed to be a vocal and an audible contribution for the audio book, Lawrence and I both repeated what we'd said. For the audio book, pretending that we were having our conversation over a drink in the bar.
Oh, wow.
We didn't actually do clinking of glasses and things, but anyway. And then the final one, the 6, I said 5 sections, I should have said 6 sections. As you know, was a conversation with you. So that's the conversations. Now, as for the actual articles, there are quite a lot of them. I suppose I could pick out a few. Porno philosophy in section 1 is one of the only 2 really hostile. Perhaps there are 3 or 4 hostile reviews. Most of my reviews are very complimentary. This one is Lynn Margulis and her son Dorian Sagan on sex, and it was called Porno Philosophy. The next one is Determinism and Dialectics as Tale of Sound and Fury. That's a review of Stephen Rose and Lewontin and Kamin. I nearly said awful book. Anyway, but you have to read it.
Is that the book called Not in Our Genes? I think it was.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And
you described that as your most sarcastic review, I think.
Yes, and that's right. And it was one that it actually led to a libel threat from Stephen Rose, which fortunately was dropped. There are a couple of science fiction books, one by Fred Hoyle, one by Daniel F. Galloy. I am interested in science fiction. I'm not a great connoisseur of it, but those 2 books gave me the opportunity to expatiate a bit on what I think science fiction can do. I really do believe that science fiction can teach good science. I think you can actually broaden your mind with respect to science. And those 2 books exemplify that for me. There's an introduction, there's the forward to Bronowski's book. Bronowski's the book of his famous Ascent of Man television show, which was just marvelous. And his daughter invited me when
Lisa Jardine.
Jardine. She invited me to write the foreword to a second edition of the book after his death. which I did. I'm quite pleased with that one.
You describe him as the last Renaissance man.
Yes, it's a bit of a cliche, but
Yeah,
I think
but
it probably fits him okay.
Yeah.
Have I done 5 minutes yet? Let me have a look.
Yes, well, I mean, some of the other names you interact with in the book, you review them or introduce them or write forwards for them or otherwise have conversations with them include, as you say, Bronowski, Carl Sagan, Fred Hoyle, Napoleon Chagnon, Christopher Hitchens, Dan Dennett, but also Peter Medawar. And I was going to ask you actually, why you clearly admired Peter Medawar enormously. He was a fantastic writer.
Yes.
He was also a great scientist, won the Nobel Prize. He had a dose of mischief in him, I think.
Certainly did, yes.
I was lucky enough to meet him only once when he put me on the spot by saying, "What's the greatest English novel?" And I didn't have a good answer. He told me it was Middlemarch. I don't know whether you agree with that. And anyway, tell me what it is about Peter Medawar that you particularly admire, and perhaps in a sense you are the Peter Medawar de nos jours.
Gosh, really? Oh, thank you, Matt.
Even better writer in many ways.
The book is dedicated to his memory, and the introduction that I wrote for the book quotes him quite largely. You're quite right, he had a great sense of mischief. He had a kind of, what's the word? A kind of lofty, I don't want to say patriarchal. It's a word like that. I've forgotten what the right word is. It would be like that. He had a wit. I think I said in the book that almost my definition of wit, as opposed to just telling jokes, which is not really wit, is something like Peter Medawar, something like his, the utterly mischievous, which infuriates feminists, introduction to his book, Pluto's Republic. He says, why did I call it Pluto's Republic? Because a good many years ago, a neighbor whose sex chivalry forbids me to disclose, said, on learning of my interest in philosophy, said, "Don't you just adore Pluto's Republic?" And then he goes on, Pluto's Republic.
I love the quote you also give of him starting at the Remains lecture at Oxford, very distinguished lecture on science and literature. And he says, "I hope I shall not be thought ungracious if I say at the outset that nothing on earth would have induced me to attend the kind of lecture you may think I'm about to give."
It's just vintage Medawar, that. And then it's about science and literature, where he was quite scathing about some sort of literary types. And one of them replied to that. He said, "This lecturer has never been thought ungracious in his life." And that's right, he gets away with it. I mean, he was arrogant to a fault, but kind of gets away with it because he had a right to be arrogant. Another one of his arrogance, is getting away with it, was his review of Lucky Jim, Jim Watson's Double Helix, where he said something like, at the time when Jim Watson was in Cambridge, in the English school, there were about a couple of dozen brilliant scholars of English right up in the Watson class. But Watson had one towering advantage over all of them. He had something important to be clever about. Again, that's Medawar got away with that kind of thing. I don't think I do get away with it. But
on that very theme, though, you say early in the introduction to the book, science does not need languaging up to make it poetic.
Yes.
Poetry is in the subject matter, reality.
Yes.
Well, I read The Selfish Gene as a first-term undergraduate at Oxford, and it blew my mind, both as science and as writing. And it would not have done so if it had been badly written. So science does need languaging up.
Oh, no, Matt.
That's what this book is all about.
No, languaging up is, I think it was Stephen Potter who it coined the phrase languaging up. And it doesn't mean good writing.
Oh, sorry.
It means Sude's Corner stuff. It means using long words for the sake of it, pretending to be more intellectual than you are.
Right.
So
you're not against purple prose if it's
no,
good
I'm not. I mean, Meadow again said we must limit our purple prose. Or he said the science writer must not let his fingers stray toward the diapason. And I said, well, sometimes you can. I mean, I don't know about you. I allow myself about 2 purple prose passages per book, and I kind of enjoy it. But you have to be a little bit restrained with your purple passages. But I don't think we should censor them at all. No.
And just on that, you're famous for coining the word meme. Are there any other coinages that you're sort of particularly proud of? Because it's quite a mark of a writer is that you've left something in the English language. That
yes. Well, Maynard Smith was very good at it, wasn't he? All his, I can't think of any now, but he was very good at that. I suppose survival machine. An animal is a survival machine. The blind watchmaker.
Yes. Of course.
Climbing mountain problem. Some of my book titles.
Book titles, actually. Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Maybe even the God Delusion.
Yes.
Can I ask you about scientific philistinism? You touch on it in various places in the book. The double standard by which, in Britain particularly, much more than in America, it is acceptable to boast about ignorance of scientific topics. Not knowing the second law of thermodynamics is something to be perfectly proud of, whereas not recognizing that someone was quoting from Hamlet's soliloquy to be or not to be would be quite disgraceful. Does that double standard bother you, and is it a problem with our culture, or are we being too fussy?
I think it was, and I think it was in the previous collection that I quoted Bernard Levin along those lines, but being sort of making fun of science in that way. There was an article in the Telegraph where the science editor of the Telegraph, who was rather good, I've forgotten his name, but he was good. He was a good science writer. You probably can prompt me on that.
Roger Highfield? No.
Roger Highfield, that's right. I think it was probably Roger Highfield. He was quoting from some research which showed that I think it was 28% of people in Britain thought that the Earth took 1 month to orbit the sun. And he was quoting this as being a rather shocking indictment of British education. So he quoted this, and then the editor of Telegraph then put in brackets, "Doesn't it, Ed?" And that was a kind
in the published article.
Yes, the editor added, "Doesn't it, Ed?" after the science editor had said that this is a rather shocking figure. Now, of course, the science editor didn't really think it took 1 month for Earth to orbit the sun, but he thought it was a good joke to pretend that he was that ignorant, because it was okay, it was cool to be ignorant of science. And it was as though somebody had said that, isn't it shocking the number of people who think that, Shakespeare wrote the Odyssey? And if the editor had said, "Didn't he, Ed?" It's inconceivable, isn't it? And that's the double standard that you've just been talking about.
Yeah. And on a similar topic, you use a word in here that I'd not seen before, which is francophoniism.
Yes.
And in several places, you have a go at Bergson, Dujardin, Foucault, Derrida, the sort of French tradition of philosophy that's very much about structuralism and all that kind of thing, and which, again, you quote Medawar as saying that there's a whispering campaign against the virtues of clarity.
That's right. Medawar said whispering campaign against the virtues of clarity, and then he said, the suggestion is that if you've got ideas which are profoundly difficult to understand, they're best expressed by using language which is deliberately unclear. And he goes on, what a preposterously silly idea. I'm reminded of an air raid warden in wartime Oxford, who, when the spirit of the blackout was being violated, advised people to wear dark glasses. He, however, was being funny on purpose. Medawar also used a lovely phrase in the review of the Teilhard de Chardin book. He talking about Naturphilosophie, he said a philosophical indoor pastime of German origin, which has never contributed anything to the storehouse of human thought. Then he says, French is not a language that lends itself to the ponderous idiom of nature philosophy, and Teilhard has accordingly resorted to that tipsy, euphoristic prose poetry, which is one of the more tiresome manifestations of the French spirit. Again, terrible arrogance. But
arguably, you and I and Medawar are losing that battle. That a sort of Derrida Foucault way of looking at the world is gradually conquering on all fronts, and that
let's hope not. That I mean, let me read a passage which I quoted in an earlier book. I think it was in it was in Devil's Chaplain. We can clearly see, this is an English translation, of course, but I think it's pretty fair. We can clearly see that there is no biunivocal correspondence between linear signifying links or archy writing, depending on the author, and this multi-referential, multi-dimensional machinic catalysis. The symmetry of scale, the transversality, the pathic, non-discursive character of their expansion, all these dimensions remove us from the logic of the excluded middle and reinforce us in our dismissal of the ontological binarism we criticized previously. Now, that is not a man who wants to be understood.
I didn't understand a word of it.
That is pure showing off. That is saying, you don't understand a word I'm saying, so I must be cleverer than you.
But it works. People think they're clever, these people.
People think, I know. I somewhere quoted a woman met a philosopher at I think a cocktail party or something. And she said something like, I found your last book very difficult to understand. Oh, thank you, he said. Obviously taking it as a compliment. So there are certain fields, which I hope science is not one, where to be understood is to be diminished in people's eyes, where you have to pretend to be more profound. I think it was Medawar again called it physics envy. Physics is genuinely hard to understand. And so physicists, in order to try to explain their subject, like Peter Atkins or Lawrence Krauss, have to really work hard to be clearer, as clear as possible. But if your subject doesn't have any great depth to it, your physics envy leads you to language it up in the sense of Stephen Potter, to use long words which nobody understands or very few people understand as a way of showing off how clever you are. And that passage I just read from, it was from Guattari, I think. And here's another one from Gilles Deleuze, who's a great hero of that school of thought. In the first place, singularities events correspond to heterogeneous series which are organized into a system which is neither stable nor unstable, but rather metastable, endowed with a potential energy, wherein the differences between series are distributed. In the second place, singularities possess a process of auto-unification. It goes on and on like that. Then there's Lacan, who suggested that let me try and find this place.
And of course, Alan Sokal and Peter Boghossian and people like that have done a brilliant job of.
Terrific. I mean, that's wonderful.
What they do is they write fake articles of this kind, intended to be stupid and seen through, and then get them published in real journals as if they weren't.
Yes, exactly. Lacan said, yeah, that's right. the erectile organ is equivalent to the square root of -1 of the signification produced above, of the jouissance that it restores by the coefficient of its statement to the function of lack of signifier, -1. I added to that, we do not need the mathematical expertise of Sokol and Brickmore to assure us that the author of this stuff is a fake. Perhaps he is genuine when he speaks of non-scientific subjects, but a philosopher who is caught equating the erectile organ to the square root of -1 has, for my money, blown his credentials when it comes to things that I don't know anything about.
Can I ask you, your conversation with Christopher Hitchens, was a number of years ago, obviously, because he died a number of years ago. How concerned are you that we are slowly becoming more and more religious as a civilization? I read a book by Catherine Nixie called The Darkening Age about the Christian takeover of the ancient world.
Oh, I've read it, yes.
How brutal it was.
Yes.
And it had uncomfortable echoes for me. And the degree to which I now live in a society where essentially by hook or by crook, blasphemy is being reintroduced as a crime, particularly against Muslim targets, but also to some degree against other religious targets. And when I contrast that with the confidence of Francis Crick in the 1960s, thinking, let's turn the college chapels into swimming pools because nobody will ever want to go to a church service again in 50 years' time. It does feel to me like the four atheists who were riding high 20 years ago, Hitchens, Dawkins, Dennett, and Harris, aren't winning.
I think Islam is a special case. I think that for some reason, the woke left has decided that any attack on Islam is an attack on oppressed people. And therefore, even though the Islamic treatment of women, of gays, is shocking, or should be shocking to their very ideals, their own left-wing liberal ideals, nevertheless, because most Islamic people are brown and not white, therefore you can't attack Islam. It's as though they think Islam is a race, which of course it isn't. So I think it is a special case. I'm not sure the same is true of Christianity. The statistics show that the number of people professing Christianity is going down, not just in, even in the United States of America, which is of course by far the most religious country in the Western world. Even there, the statistics are encouraging that moving in the right direction. The number of people who profess no religion at all is now up, I think, to about 25% in America, which is comparable to that of any particular Christian denomination.
And actually, I've seen similar polls from the Arab world that although obviously, the polls have to be anonymous, you're not supposed to admit to being irreligious. Nonetheless, an increasing percentage of people in Arab countries say they don't believe in anything. Maybe
I'm very encouraged by that, and I get a lot of letters from places like Iran and Egypt and Saudi Arabia saying that we can't come out, we can't admit it, but that's the way things are going. And another indication of that is the rate at which my books, especially the God Delusion, are being read in Islamic countries. There was an illicit bootleg translation of the God Delusion into Arabic, which was made available for download as PDF in Arabic. And it's been downloaded 13 million times in these various, in Saudi Arabia, 3 million in Saudi Arabia, for example. Because of that, my foundation, Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, was encouraged to start a more formal translation project where rather than have sort of this particular bootleg translation, we actually pay people to do a professional job translating. And these books are now available for download, for free download, as I get no royalties from this, in Arabic, Urdu, Farsi, and Indonesian. So the God Delusion, various others of my books are now available for free download as PDFs in those four languages of the Islamic world. And that's going very well. I'm really very encouraged by that.
I suppose going back to Lawrence Krauss's argument with you about how in your face you should be in being an atheist, as it were, that one of my other worries is that the milder forms of religion, the Church of England, which is basically a vaccine, if you like, rather than a virus,
Exactly.
Are losing out to the stronger forms. And maybe people like you help that process by polarizing the issue.
I worry about that.
You'll have heard that argument a lot.
Yeah, I do worry about it. Like you, I regard the Church of England as largely benign. You're quite right to call it a vaccine. I mean, you can actually immunize somebody against the more virulent strain of the virus, which might be, say, Roman Catholicism, by maybe sort of baptizing a child into the Church of England. Yes, I do worry about that. And of course, I mean, I'm sure we both know bishops and vicars who are extremely nice people, intelligent people, nice to have a conversation with. It would be a shame if they were driven out by the more virulent strains of the virus, as you say.
I have a half memory of you writing, I think, a Spectator diary about attending a church service in South Georgia on Christmas Day or whatever it was, and being mildly critical of the rest of the congregation for not knowing what to do, which you did.
Yes, that's right. Quite right. And I mean, in the God Delusion, I've got to think about almost 3 pages of quotes from the Bible, which I think everyone ought to know. Otherwise, they can't take their allusions in English literature. I mean, things like throw a glass darkly and things like that. And there are hundreds of them. And I think it's a sad lack of education if people don't know the Bible for that kind of reason. So I'm all in favor of biblical education as long as it's not held up as being true.
Right. Just another question that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, and I'd just know your view. And it's about science journalism, which has been my profession, never yours, of course, but you'll have consumed lots of it. Science journalists don't criticize scientists on the whole. They relay science. And that's not true of political journalism or business journalism or even arts journalism. Do you think there needs to be a profession called science critic? Somebody who isn't a scientist, but who reviews science and says, this chap's done a bad job and he hasn't made his case. This chap's done a good job and has made her case, or whatever it might be.
I mean, I suppose I do science journalism, and quite a lot of this book is actually science journalism.
Yeah, sorry, of course. Yeah.
Well, I mean, no. I mean, you meant it kindly, but I don't regard it as a thing to be ashamed of to be a science journalist and science critic, and obviously, since many of the essays in this book are actually book reviews, and many of the book reviews are, or some at least of them, are critical, but often they're appreciative as well. Yes, I think.
Oh, Richard's frozen. Oh, you've unfrozen again. You froze briefly.
Yeah. Was my voice frozen as well, or just the image?
Yes, but only for 5 seconds. So yeah, I think we got the gist.
Okay, fine.
Of what you were saying. One final question, and then I'm going to read out some questions from the audience. I was thrilled to read Avi Loeb's book Extraterrestrial recently. It's about his argument, he's a professor of astrophysics at Harvard, that this object called Oumuamua, which was an interstellar object that flew through the solar system recently, was more likely to be the product of an intelligent civilization than not. And it's all about probabilities and so on. And I'm not asking you whether he's right or wrong, but I was reminded of it when I read the epilogue of your book, which is something you want read at your funeral, I gather, where you talk about the extraordinary improbability of being alive, of being you and me on this wonderful planet, and how many gazillions of other possible outcomes there could have been that didn't involve you and me. Do you want to just make your little argument there? Because you have a spaceship image in that of
yes,
coming across
that's right.
the Earth.
Yes. If you imagine being in a spaceship sent out from a doomed Earth, it's going to be destroyed, say, by a meteorite similar to the one that destroyed the dinosaurs. And so we send a pioneering spaceship of say, sleeping humans in capsules, in the forlorn hope that one day they may hit a planet or be intercepted by extraterrestrial life or something. And of course, it's a very, very forlorn hope. And yet, if we imagine that it really did happen, that the spaceship was unthinkably lucky and did land on a beautiful planet where life was possible and great. And we imagine the passengers in the spaceship stumbling out, blinking into the light and marveling at their luck, their good fortune. And yet that is what's happened to us. I mean, we have been born into this world in the face of stupefying odds against, I mean, the odds against a particular sperm hitting a particular egg in our parents' generation, grandparents' generation, etc., just beyond contemplation. But here, somebody has to be here, and it happens to be us. But I mean, we should rejoice in our fortune, our good fortune in being here, exactly as though we were on a spaceship that had had the good fortune to land on a wonderful planet. It is a wonderful planet in many ways, not always.
That's a great way of putting it. Well, I'm going to read some questions to you. I've got some wonderful ones, so let's get through as many as we can. Somebody anonymous says, I read in a recent interview with you that you are working on your first novel. I'm very excited about this and want to know how you're getting on with this and how different it is to writing non-fiction books.
Yes, I put that rather ill-advisedly in a Spectator diary a few weeks ago, and I was indeed. I wrote about 4 chapters of this novel, and I rather lost heart, I'm sorry to say, and I started to disappoint the questioner. The plot of the novel was to be that a scientist, I made her female to be sort of in the swim, that she managed to reconstitute Lucy, the Australopithecus, or something like Lucy anyway. And so Lucy would be born. I think I actually had her give birth to Lucy. And then the most of the book was going to be about the sociological, psychological, political fallout of this. What would be Lucy's moral status? Where would Lucy stand in the relation? Would she be human or animal? Would she be put in a zoo? Would she be treated as a human from a moral point of view, etc.? I may return to it, but for the moment I've a bit lost heart with that interview.
But do you find, if you have a conversation with a novelist, they sometimes say things like, oh gosh, well, we can all make it up. It's so much easier for us. To which my response is, no, it's terrifying not to have the handrail of facts,
Yeah, I see that both ways, actually. I found that things that I, as a scientist, might hesitate to speculate about because it would be written off as too speculative. If you're writing a novel, you could put into the mouth of your hero, your science hero, speculations which you might not wish to own as a scientist yourself.
Right.
And I had quite a lot of dialogue of my heroine and her colleagues in the pub, discussing how the problems of how to reconstitute Lucy, and I put into it some speculative stuff of my own, which I couldn't get away with in a scientific paper because it had no evidence and that kind of thing. So in a way, I think it's easier to write it as fiction.
Okay, right. Well, take that, novelists. When did you discover you had a knack for writing? Asks Jerry. And how? You know, what was the moment when you realized that your future lay in books just as much as in labs?
Matt, that question should have been put to you as well. I mean,
well,
I think you're a marvelous writer, and
but I've not done great science like you. So you were much further into your scientific career when you started being a writer.
You know, I think the Oxford tutorial is quite a step in the right direction. There's one essay in Books to Furnish a Life called Tutorial Driven, which is a defense of the Oxford tutorial against what I thought of as a kind of Philistinism of trying to sort of say that a university education should be all about learning facts. And I like the idea that in a tutorial you are supposed to think for yourself and raise difficult questions, discuss controversial things where there's no settled answer. So the Oxford essay, or the Cambridge essay, seems to me to be a wonderful training ground for writing for a general audience.
My computer keeps tinging because Jerry, who put that question, it must be my friend Jerry Ostrom, because he's just texted, I did put that question to you both, but I was, anyway, there we are.
Okay, fine. What's your answer then?
Wonderful tutor at Oxford, David Roberts, you probably remember him.
Yes,
once said to me, do you know, I think you're better at writing about things than doing them, which was intended as a compliment, I think, but it didn't really. But
yes.
But I, you know, and I quite quickly realised that I enjoyed, writing up my PhD. I enjoyed that. All my colleagues were saying, I hate this writing up business. So there comes a moment when you realise that you enjoy certain things.
Yes.
Anyway, moving on. Daniel asks, I was wondering if you've enjoyed any more recent sci-fi. Is there an heir to Douglas Adams? A good novel I'd recommend is Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time from 2015, very stimulating evolutionary aspects.
Oh, good. I don't know that. Adrian
Tchaikovsky.
Okay, thank you. What's the name of the book again?
Children of Time.
Children of Time. Thank you. I've written that down. Well, I'm about halfway through Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy at the moment. That's one of the great classics of science fiction. I'm a bit disappointed in it, actually. It's sort of, although it's set tens of thousands years into the future, it might as well be in the present. I mean, the people there are just behaving like ordinary humans, which they wouldn't, I think, in 10,000 years' time. It's a great sweeping epic, sort of a bit like Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's sort of like that, but set in the galaxy. Is there an heir to Douglas Adams? No, there never could be, I don't think. I mean, that's wonderful comedy, and it's not making fun of science, because I mean, he was a great lover of science, but it's seeing the funny side of science and seeing the deep questions of science in a funny, witty way. So I think he's
like 42 and all that. Yeah.
Right?
42. You know, the computer that goes off and calculates the meaning of life, and it comes back and says the answer is 42.
42. But then the infinite improbability drive is a profound sort of thought, and and the restaurant at the end of the universe, where the people at the table are approached by a large bovine creature, which announces itself as the dish of the day, and then goes into the morality of eating animals, and then says it was decided to breed a race of animals that wanted to be eaten and was capable of saying so. And I mean, that's a wonderfully comedic way of tackling a profound moral dilemma.
Here's a question from Matthias, which is one that I wrestle with a lot and am less confident about answering than I would have been 10 or 20 years ago. How can non-scientists filter out pseudoscience from real science? For example, is there an easy way to detect non-credible sources when it comes to views on vaccination? I mean, you know, I know pseudoscience when I see it, but I can't come up with clear rules as to why you should occasionally listen to mavericks and heretics, and often you shouldn't.
I quite agree. It's very difficult, and of course, any scientists from any one field of science are not capable of understanding another field. I mean, I'm completely incapable of understanding modern physics, for example, and so when I read about the extraordinary findings of quantum mechanics, I have to trust that the physicists know what they're doing, although I cannot actually evaluate that. I know that it's been subjected to the sort of discipline that science has put in place, like peer review, like in the case of biological medical science, double-blind control trials, so that and repetition of experiments and things, so that although you can't evaluate it yourself, you do know that if it's published in a reputable journal like Science or Nature, and it's been peer reviewed, and its experiments perhaps been repeated, you can trust it even though you can't actually understand it.
Right.
Mavericks, yes, that's a difficult problem, because of course they are occasionally right. They're much more often wrong, but they can be right. Yes.
Exactly. Darwin was one at one point and all that. But,
yes.
You know, not everyone's a Darwin. Lydia says, I think I've heard you regretted the title Selfish Gene would lead to confusion. Would you give it another title if you could go back? You actually discussed that in the book. Do you want to give?
Yes. Well, I was, before the book was taken up by Oxford University Press, I spoke to Tom Mashler, who was the editor at Jonathan Cape, and he liked the book, but he said it shouldn't be called The Selfish Gene, it should be called The Immortal Gene. And I think he may have been right. I mean, I think immortal is a sort of word that, it's a poetic word, it's an upward as opposed to what he called a downward. Selfish is a downward, he said. My editor at Oxford University Press, Michael Rogers, a wonderful editor, was absolutely adamant The Selfish Gene is the better title. So I don't know. Various other people, I mean, John Krebs suggested Immortal Coils, which is a witty pun on Shakespeare, when he shuffled off this mortal coil. So Immortal Coils would be DNA. Desmond Morris suggested The Gene Machine, which I think is another fine title. Mm-hmm. The Selfish Gene has been misunderstood, no question about it. I mean, if you read it by title only, as some people have done, you think it's about selfishness. You think it's about, or it might even be an advocacy of selfishness, which is a terrible misunderstanding of the book. It's actually the reverse. Yes, I think that there's a lot to be said for being the wrong title, but no.
Maybe it should be republished under the title The Immortal Gene.
I don't think Michael Rogers would ever forgive me. He was wonderful. I mean, I've told the story often enough, but when he'd read the book or part of the book before it was agreed to be published there, he phoned me up and he said, yelled at the top of his voice, "I must have that book!" And I thought, that's, you can't resist that kind of enthusiasm from a publisher, so
He's a wonderful guy.
I never regretted going into Michael Rogers, and then my next 3 books were all published by him as well.
Well, it's an extraordinary story that an academic publisher like Oxford should produce such a bestseller, isn't it? It's unusual. Well, unusual these days, maybe not those days.
Yes.
Does Richard have any advice for a young academic researcher in STEM who aspires to write a popular science book in their field? M. Poulton asks. Good luck.
Well, I mean, advice on how to write. I mean, once again, Matt, you should weigh in here. But I mean, one of my rules is obvious. Really, put yourself in the position of the reader. It's amazing how many people don't do that.
And you make that explicit right at the start of The Selfish Gene.
I did. That's right. Yes.
And I quite agree. I think that's absolutely fundamental to how to write a good book. So that's good advice.
It applies not just to books, but to instruction manuals for running a washing machine or anything like that. It's amazing how many writings do not put themselves in the position of the reader.
Yes. Are you still close with Sam Harris and Dan Dennett? And can we expect a future discussion from the 3 horsemen of atheism?
Yes. We did actually meet in Australia at one of the big conferences in Melbourne. And Christopher Hitchens was dead by then, so we co-opted Ayaan Hirsi Ali to be the 4th.
Brilliant.
He was actually originally supposed to be in the original one, but she was called away at the last minute. He had to go to Holland, where she had been an MP for some reason. So it was fairly appropriate that she should come in as the 4th member in that Australian discussion. But yes, it would be nice to have another meeting.
Great. Well, there's a plan for somebody to arrange.
Yes.
What gives you hope and what gives you despair about humanity?
Well, one of the things that gives me hope is reading your books, Matt, your optimistic books, and those of
Steven Pinker and others, yes. Talking of which, How Innovation Works is just out in paperback, and my publisher
there we are.
Would kill me if I didn't plug it, but
exactly.
Penguin will probably kill me now for doing so.
It's a wonderful book, which I thoroughly enjoyed myself, and The Rational Optimist as well. I don't know. I mean, I mix with pessimists as well. I mean, I want to believe the optimists, and I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that science has almost unlimited power to solve problems. But the problems do look pretty big at the moment, so I don't know whether to call myself an optimist or not. I mean, I suppose I am an optimist in the sense that I don't lie awake at night fretting like some people do. I have a pretty cheerful life. So when I'm not sort of thinking about it from an intellectual point of view, I'm a cheerful sort of optimistic person.
Arif Alam asks, are each of you excited by Jennifer Doudna's work on gene editing? And I don't know if you've read either her book, A Crack in Creation, or Walter Isaacson's, Walter Isaacson's book about her, the Code Breaker, which I think is an extraordinarily good.
Yes, I've read her own book. I haven't read his book.
Fascinating, and I mean, I do find CRISPR the most glorious story.
Yes,
and you know, not over yet. There's all sorts of exciting stuff to come from it.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Is there a better method of quality control in scientific publication than peer review, which isn't very successful, says Guy? It does have its problems these days. There's an awful lot of PAL review and gatekeeping against people who aren't part of a groupthink and so on. What would you say to that?
Yes, well, I suppose the internet is available for people who want to publish themselves, whether or not they go through the peer review process.
We've seen an awful lot of preprints during the pandemic, for example.
Yes. And I suppose for quite a while now, it's been the case that there's the kind of in-group scientists who circulate their manuscripts among themselves And so they're kind of a jump ahead of those who wait until it's actually published in a journal. I actually do think gatekeepers are quite important, because there's so much rubbish on the internet that to have some kind of quality control does seem to me to be desirable. Yeah.
Yeah. An author's first book always has a special place in their heart. How many copies of The Selfish Gene were printed in the first run? Asks Peter.
I don't know. I probably did know at the time. I have forgotten.
Would it be about 1,000 or something like that? Not even that, maybe.
I remember the publishers getting awfully excited about the rate at which it was necessary to reprint it, which in those days was something that publishers loved talking about. And we're doing a reprint already, another reprint. Yeah. I suppose nowadays, when it's all done by computer, it's cheaper and easier to do reprints all the time, and so that's less of a yardstick. But I'm afraid I don't remember the answer to that question.
Fair enough. Okay, well, the last question is more of a compliment than a question, but it's from Florian, who says, what gives you the energy and motivation to provide us with so much outstanding work and unspeakable joy?
Oh, how nice. Well, science itself, actually. I think science is so marvelous, so wonderful, and getting more so all the time. And I think that the time in which we live, the century in which we live, is unprecedented. You mentioned Jennifer Doudna's work just now, and so much is going on. It is a wonderful thing to be in a scientific century like this and to be able to communicate it to people.
You wouldn't want to be living at any other time, would you, once you think about it? I mean, thank God.
I've got to go to the dentist tomorrow, and I wouldn't wish to go to the dentist in an earlier century.
Well, it's 1 minute to past, and we said we'd end at past on the dot. So may I thank Richard Dawkins very much for this book and for sharing his thoughts with an audience today. And I'd also like to thank Primrose Hill, the bookshop, who are collaborating with this event, and Penguin Live and the How To Academy, who have organized the event beautifully. And it's all gone very smoothly on the technical front. So thank you very much for that. And thank you, the audience, for your excellent questions. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you, Richard. All the best. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.